Good day. Today in London is the day after the celebration of Christmas, but it is also a public holiday, as I believe it is in several other countries. It is not, of course, a holiday, or at least I believe it is not a holiday, in Russia or Ukraine. The Orthodox Church in these countries celebrates Christmas on a different day in January. They've not changed their calendar to bring it into line with the Western Gregorian calendar, as the Greek Orthodox Church has done. And one way or the other, there's been apparently no slackening of the fighting in Ukraine over this Christmas period, over this Western Christmas period. Both sides have ruled out a winter truce, a New Year truce, and I've no reason to think that things are going to change at all over the next couple of days, even when the holiday season in these countries formally begins. Anyway, for the moment, we have no actual sign of a slackening in the fighting, but also inevitably all kinds of claims made backwards and forwards. The Ukrainians, for example, recently claimed that they captured a town, or perhaps it should be said, sort of big village called Kremenaya, which is in, I believe it's in the Lugansk region, and that this is the new Ukrainian allegations in the media have been circulating to that effect. Though the Ukrainian General Staff did not say anything about this. And the leadership of the Lugansk People's Republic has said that this is absolute nonsense. Kremenaya remains firmly under Russian control. Kiev has launched an information attack to seize Kremenaya. The situation on the ground remains unchanged. Artillery duels continue. Poor conditions are preventing forces from making any significant move. And that is a quotation from Rodion Miroshnik, who is a former ambassador of the Lugansk People's Republic to Moscow. And in fact, there have been other reports of a similar nature from the Russian side, all of which dispute claims that there's been a capture of Kremenaya by the Ukrainians over the last couple of days. What does seem to have happened, however, is that the Ukrainians did launch some kind of attack towards Kremenaya. And Vitaly Kiselyov, who is an actual serving official of the Lugansk People's Republic, says that the armed forces of Ukraine suffered heavy losses in the past 24 hours and once again carried out strikes on peaceful cities. They lost a little over 60 troops who were killed, as well as about 10 pieces of light armoured equipment, 3 armoured personnel carriers, and 4 drones that our guys downed. And Kiselyov noted, this is according to TASS, that the cities of Svatovo and Kremenaya remain a very tense area for our troops. The Ukrainian armed forces do keep trying to attack, but they are more and more unwilling to do so. That's from Mr. Kiselyov, as I said, who's providing us with the official Russian take on what's been happening. So clearly there was some sort of Ukrainian attack on Kremenaya. That led to excited claims in the Ukrainian media on Monday night, that Kremenaya had been taken, but it seems that it has not. And with this, I'm going to go with the Russians. They're quite clear that Kremenaya remains under their control and that there's been no significant change in the position in the front lines. Now, there are lots of other reports. There was a report, again, a little earlier, that there'd been some sort of Ukrainian drone attack, again, on the giant Russian Engels air base deep in Russia, in Saratov region. This is the base where much of Russia's long-range intercontinental bombers, that's where they are based, and it's from that base that many of those bombers take off when they launch missile strikes on Ukraine. Anyway, there was a reports of some kind of a missile or drone strike, again from Ukraine. Presumably, this is again a strike with these adaptations of the Soviet-era Strij drone converted into some kind of a cruise missile. There are very, very incomplete reports as to exactly what has happened, but the information suggests that the air defenses at Engels worked, that they were able to shoot down these drones or drone, but that some debris from the drones did fall to earth, and 3 people at the airbase were killed. Now, that's all the information I have. It may be that there's more information. It may be that satellite photos will reveal a difference in the overall picture, but to be frank, I doubt it. Another Russian official has commented also about the extent of the losses that Ukraine is suffering, and according to this person, who is an official, I believe, the Donetsk People's Republic, Ukraine is now losing approximately 2 battalions of people a day in the fighting. One in the fighting in Bakhmut, another in fighting that is taking place in other places on the front lines, primarily in the north, in this area of Svatovo, Kremenaya, Krasny Liman, which I was talking about, but also no doubt in Vuhledar and around Donetsk. And this is some information that was provided to Russian television by an officer of the Lugansk People's Republic, Andrei Marochko, discussing the situation of the Ukrainian forces in Bakhmut. He says the situation along the line of contact does not favor Ukrainian troops. So to say, they're suffering catastrophic losses in various areas, primarily in the city of Artyomovsk. That's what the Russians call Bakhmut. And he says, Marochko says, Ukrainian forces are currently losing up to a battalion a day in Artyomovsk, in the Artyomovsk area, and the situation is similar near Soledar and Svatovo. Svatovo is the area further north where the Ukrainians, some Ukrainian reports claimed that this town of Kremenaya was captured last night, but it turns out that that doesn't seem to have happened. And Marochko says that the Ukrainians are suffering all these losses because our troops, that's to say the Russian troops, are beginning to deliberately eliminate the enemy's manpower and equipment. So it's a war of attrition. The Russians are fighting it in that way. Ukraine is suffering losses, the equivalent, according to the Russians, these are Russian claims, of 2 battalions a day. Now, I have been hearing some reports about what's going on deep inside Bakhmut, and I understand that we now have a very complex situation there. Parts of the town are apparently being defended by the Aidar unit, which is another of these very strong, militant, hardline, far-right, if you like, units that the Ukrainians raised in the aftermath of the 2014 Maidan events. And it seems that there's been intense fighting in all sorts of places, but the consensus of all of these reports is that the Russians are gradually edging deeper into this small town, relatively small town. But there have been many comparisons with other battles. There's been photographs which make it look like the fighting in Bakhmut, in and around Bakhmut, is like that in the First World War, and I think that's probably a good comparison. There have been others that speak of it as being like Verdun, the Battle of Verdun, which was also fought during the First World War. I myself brought up the fact that this could be a kind of pocket Stalingrad, a battle that was fought in a town, and where a German force during the Second World War was eventually surrounded. A large German army was surrounded, causing the eventual, shall we say, it was the moment the tide on the Eastern Front in the Second World War turned conclusively in favor of the Red Army. But I think, I don't want to press this. I mean, Bakhmut is a small place, Berlin is a big place, but, there are some similarities. I mean, fighting inside the city, inside the city itself, with Russian troops pressing towards the central area and perhaps beyond, and at the same time, other forces, other Russian forces, working hard to envelop the city at the same time. Of course, all at a much reduced tempo, much slower tempo, and on a far smaller scale, with casualties which, of course, cannot compare on either side with those suffered in the Berlin battles. But anyway, that's one way, I suppose, of looking at this. So intense fighting right across the front lines. By the way, going back to those earlier reports about, Ukrainians capturing Kremenaya, there's still claims, there are lots of claims of the Russians that in fact it is they, not the Ukrainians, who are advancing in this area. Again, I'm not on the front lines myself. I'm not a reporter. I'm not able to say whether, judge between these conflicting reports. But I have found the Russian sources up to this point on battlefield movements to be significantly more reliable. Anyway, fighting, in other words, is going on. There is no sign that the fighting has diminished in intensity at any point over the Western Christmas, and all the reports confirm that Ukraine continues to suffer extremely heavy losses. Now, the Financial Times has now published another giant article, one of these huge articles, about the state of the war in Ukraine. And most of it, I have to say, looks or comes across to me very much as a pro-Ukrainian puff piece. I don't take much of it very, very seriously. But it does say some things which people in the West, in Britain especially, who've tended to accept the Western take of things, the official British view of things, which is that Ukraine is winning the war. This Financial Times article does say some things which are in discordance with this. Firstly, we see, again, more recognition in the British media of General Surovikin's abilities. And we read, for example, in this article, Surovikin has reinforced Russia's front lines with recruits drawn from the recent draft of approximately 300,000 soldiers. He also engineered a successful withdrawal from around the strategic southern city of Kherson. I'm not going to discuss whether Kherson was, in fact, a strategic city. I don't know what the criteria for saying that Kherson was a strategic city are, but anyway, I'm going to skip that. He also engineered a successful withdrawal from around the strategic southern city of Kherson, where Russian forces were in danger of being captured. Well, I don't think that was either the claim that Kherson was a strategic city or that the Russians were in danger of being captured there is true. But perhaps the interesting point is that the Financial Times is grudgingly admitting that the Russian withdrawal from Kherson was successful. And then going on with Surovikin, the Financial Times says these stronger defensive positions that Surovikin has established reduce the chances of a successful Ukrainian winter counteroffensive that cuts the land bridge which runs along the coast of the Sea of Azov and links Russia to Crimea, although a breakthrough is still regarded as possible by Western military analysts. We're not told which Western military analysts, but there we go. So an admission that the Russian front lines have hardened, that the fortifications that the Russians have built, that Surovikin has supervised, that they're actually making the prospect of a Ukrainian advance increasingly difficult. And then we have an actual quotation from a person who we are told is a Western defense advisor. Again, I don't know quite what that means or who this person is. I mean, the person is speaking anonymously. But note what he says and what he's quoted by the Financial Times as having said. Ukrainian forces certainly face their own problems. Their casualties have been high. Many are not adequately trained. Some units are clearly suffering from extreme fatigue, and they need more weapons and ammunition. Their losses have been high, not according to the Ukrainian government. I think the official Ukrainian government line is that Ukrainian losses are around 14,000 killed in the war, which is 10% of what some people claim, though, as I said, no figure can be verified, but I don't think anybody takes the Ukrainian claims especially seriously. But here we have a Western defense advisor telling the Financial Times and getting published by the Financial Times, and he admits that Ukrainian casualties have been high. Many are not adequately trained. Again, that's not what we've been told, but I don't think anybody who's followed this war closely would dispute that. And then some units are clearly suffering from extreme fatigue, and they need more weapons and ammunition. A tired, exhausted army, as others have said, others in the British media have said, and that's a little bit like what this Western defense advisor, whoever he, I presume it is a he, is telling us. But then, of course, we have the PUF. But their morale and determination are still incomparably higher than their opponents, and they have been much more effective than the Russians in mobilizing. Well, all I will say about that is that General Zaluzhny, the commander of the Ukrainian military, who has recently given his interview to The Economist, he appears to think otherwise. He says that the Russian mobilization has been a success, and that the Russian military doesn't seem to be facing any significant problems of morale. But, as I said, Western defense analyst, advisor, likes to tell us a different story. Whilst I'm on that topic of General Zaluzhny, I should say that there is a report circulating that the relationship between Zaluzhny and Zelensky has now finally broken down, and that Zelensky has made a decision to sack Zaluzhny if and when Bakhmut falls. Well, that might be rumour, probably is. I just pass it on. What is certainly rumour is a story which has just appeared in the Wall Street Journal. This, at extraordinary length, describes a paranoid, isolated Putin, skulking presumably in a bunker somewhere, out of touch, giving surreal and delusional orders to Russian forces on the front lines, having apparently become completely detached from reality. Now, again, if you follow this article in the Wall Street Journal, it again doesn't seem to be particularly well sourced. And I'm going to say straightforwardly that I think it's absolute nonsense. I don't think there's any truth to any of this at all. There is a very strange passage in which, for example, there's a claim that Putin himself telephoned the commander of the Russian forces defending Krasny Liman at the time of the Ukrainian attack on the town, and ordering this person or telling this person to hang on at all costs. Now, I followed that battle in incredible amount of detail, the battle at Liman, and I am absolutely sure that if a call like that had been made from Putin to the soldiers, to the commander in Liman, I would have learnt about it. It would have circulated, there would have been information that such an order was given. And I say that because, of course, the troops who were defending Liman were not even actually, all of them, Russian regular soldiers. There were some Russian regular soldiers in Liman at that time, but around half the soldiers there were irregular troops and members of the Lugansk militia. So I have no doubt at all, given the massive Russian coverage over what was going on in Liman, given the fact that a lot of the commentaries that appeared about that fight in Liman came from people on the Russian side who are far from enthusiastic supporters of Vladimir Putin, to put it mildly. I'm absolutely sure, I'm confident that if such a call had been made in that kind of battle, in that kind of way, as I said, something about it would have leaked out and I would know it. I would add that this whole Wall Street Journal account of Putin's is one that is completely at variance, both with my impression of the man, of how he carries out things, how he manages things. It seems to me that he's very much someone who works through the chain of command, if you like, both in civilian and military matters. I think he's very unlike him to come out and take a direct role in fighting. After all, he's a civilian. He's never served in the military, and I don't think he thinks of himself as any kind of general or anything of that kind. So I think it is most unlike, would be most out of character for him to behave in that way. And I have to say, the entire discussion of Putin's that appears in this Wall Street Journal article is a total variance with this extremely active and engaged Putin that I've been seeing at work over the last few weeks. Now, as I've said, he's been maintaining an incredible pace. He's been on important summit meetings to places like Uzbekistan, Bishkek. He's had contacts with all sorts of people. He's spoken to Erdogan a number of times. He's spoken to various other leaders in various times. He's had discussions, as I recall, certainly with Olaf Scholz of Germany. Discussions with the president of Iran. He's maintained his diplomatic contacts very actively. He's presided over meetings of his government discussing economic policy. He's attended at least 2 meetings that I recall of the Coordination Council. He's regularly met his Security Council. He's visited Surovikin's headquarters, which we are told is indeed in the combat zone, wherever that is. We're told, and of course, he's attended this massive meeting at the Collegium of the Ministry of Defense, and he's given multiple interviews to the media. And in fact, he's just given another one. Well, I say just because this is one of those, it's a big television interview. The Kremlin, by the way, has not provided a transcript of this particular interview. Probably, as I said, the format isn't really suitable for a transcript. But anyway, there's a big sprawling thing all about various actions and decisions that he made and over the course of the war. Most of it's retrospective. None of it, in my opinion, is in any way new. And of course, there is in it a reference to the fact that the Russians have always been willing to conduct negotiations, and in order to try to bring this conflict to an end. And this has led to all kinds of excited commentary in the West that Putin is now finally talking about negotiations. But Putin has always said that he is willing to negotiate an end to the conflict. On the first day that the conflict began, when shortly after Russian troops entered Ukraine, Zelensky said that he was made a broadcast to the effect that he was prepared to negotiate a settlement with Putin. And Putin, in fact, gave a stop order. He told the Russian troops, much to the anger of the Russian military, apparently, he gave them an order to stop and to discontinue their advances, which lasted for about 24 hours, in the hope that Zelensky would come forward with a negotiating team. And of course, Zelensky eventually did, but it took weeks before that happened. And then, of course, there were negotiations throughout March, culminating in the meeting in Istanbul, when a draft agreement was actually, well, it wasn't initialed, but all the indications are that an agreement came very close to being agreed at that time. And it is now accepted that Ukraine walked away from that agreement. It wasn't Putin or the Russians. Ukraine walked away from that agreement as a result of the urging of the Western powers, especially the United States and Britain, with the British Prime Minister Boris Johnson taking an extremely active role. And that essentially was the point when negotiations between the Russians and the Ukrainians broke down. The Russians sent a response to certain proposals the Ukrainians made in Istanbul. The Ukrainians never replied to them. And the result is that the whole negotiating process has been at a complete standstill ever since. But the Russians ever so often come out and do say that yes, they are willing to negotiate and that they're not unhappy about the prospect of negotiations. On the contrary, they desire them. And whilst I'm on this topic, I'm going to say something briefly about a opinion poll supposedly carried out by the Russian security agencies, which was reported to the Kremlin and which was published by the dissident Russian website Medusa, which, by the way, I believe is actually based in Latvia. But having said that, it is an interesting website, actually. Anyway, this website has been quoted and cited many, many times in the media in the West over the last few weeks, ever since that article appeared on Medusa. And it supposedly shows a collapse in Russia for support for the war. And we read, for example, in that very same article in the Financial Times that I've just been quoting from, where there were all those admissions about the Ukrainians suffering high losses and all that, it says popular Russian support for the war has halved between June and November to 27%, according to an unverified internal Kremlin poll reported by exiled news outlet Medusa. Actually, in my opinion, seriously misrepresents the opinion poll. The opinion poll does not say that support for the war is 27%. What the opinion poll says is that 52% of Russians seek a negotiated end to the war, whereas 27% apparently want the war to be fought to its conclusion. Now, there's been a lot of attempts to draw all kinds of conclusions and inferences from that opinion poll. But what, as I said, I don't think any Western commentator has pointed out or acknowledged is that what the majority of people in this opinion poll, if it is true, I'll come to that in a moment, are saying, which is 52%, is that they are in agreement with the official policy of the Russian government. The official policy of the Russian government is, and always has been, to seek a negotiated end to the war. 27% of Russians, however, apparently don't agree. That's more than a quarter, apparently would like to see the war fought until final military victory, even though that goes beyond what the Russian government itself says it is seeking. Now, these numbers have shifted around at various times, but it's important again to stress that there doesn't seem to me to be any sign from these opinion poll figures, if they're real, that overall support for the Russian government for the war in this matter has changed to any great degree. Perhaps the best indicator of where Russian opinion stands is the rating, the trust rating that Putin at the moment is getting, which is 78% of Russians say they trust him. Now, this has gone up and down also, but it remains extraordinarily strong, and overall it is fairly stable. Now, can I just say, inevitably, since this is an unverified poll, we don't know how Medusa got his hands on it. There are some people who question whether it's real. I think it is real. The reason I think it's real is because the information it gives us is consistent with open polling carried out by other Russian opinion poll agencies. So what a secret internal Kremlin poll is telling us is what is widely known in Russia. Publicly available opinion polls in Russia, from Levada especially, are consistent with this evidence in this internal Kremlin poll, but it's much more exciting to be able to say that you have access to an internal Kremlin poll which is reporting a collapse in support for the war than to admit that this is simply an opinion poll that tells us exactly what we knew already about Russian opinion and about Russian policy. Let me repeat again, coming back to Putin, that nothing you read about Putin in the media in the West is to be taken, in my opinion, terribly seriously. Obviously, he talks in Russian, so his words have to be mediated through translation, and sometimes those translations are not always accurate, which is one reason, by the way, why I prefer to wait until official Russian translations appear of what Putin has actually said. But one way or the other, these sort of pieces about Putin appear and crop up all the time, and they never are corrected or acknowledged as wrong. And I'm afraid they do have an effect of distorting people's understanding of where the war is going. So let me just make a number of points. Even the Western Defense Advisor, who is providing his take on things to the Financial Times, except that Ukrainian forces have been taking, their casualties have been high. Many of them are not adequately trained. Some units are clearly suffering from extreme fatigue, and they need more weapons and ammunition. And in fact, it's indisputable that the last point is indisputable. Zaluzhny admitted it as much in his interview with The Economist. It's been all over the media increasingly in the United States that Western powers are struggling to keep up with Ukraine's demands for weapons, ammunition, military equipment, you name it. But we also now have an admission that casualties are high and that Ukrainian troops are often sent into battle without adequate training, which, by the way, was something that Surovikin said was the case weeks ago in the one and only interview he's given to Russian television shortly after his appointment. Now, On the topic of the size of the Ukrainian army and its level of training, I've discussed in the past how Douglas McGregor said that I believe it was the Ukrainian army actual combat forces number around 190,000 men, and this was roughly in line with what Zaluzhny said when in his interview to The Economist, when he said that the Ukrainian army now numbers, that the Ukrainians have 200,000 men who are combat capable. As I said, not exactly an explanation of what that means, but of course he did say that overall the Ukrainian armed forces number 700,000, but only 200,000 of those are combat capable. Now, someone apparently has been doing a study of recent graves in Ukraine of Ukrainian soldiers who have been killed in this fighting, and it seems that the average age now of those soldiers is around 40. And though Ukraine has been talking about carrying out another mobilization on top of the many mobilizations it carried out earlier in the year, it seems that this isn't going particularly well. And for the last couple of weeks, only around one new brigade has been created. So it does look as if, along with its ammunition and weapons shortages, Ukraine is now starting to run out of troops. And we learnt, as I said, from, these officials from the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics are now telling us that Ukraine is losing, of course it's their account, the equivalent of 2 battalions of men a day. And I come back to what that person on the Financial Times, that Western defense advisor told the Financial Times. The Ukrainians have high casualties, some of their troops are not adequately trained, some are clearly suffering from extreme fatigue, and they all need more weapons and ammunition. Where is Ukraine's pathway to victory in all this? I mean, let's put aside ideas about Ukrainian offensives, either in the north towards, the Lugansk region, taking Kremenaya and Svatovo. Let's put aside also ideas of an advance from Zaporozhye to cut the land bridge and take Crimea. Zaluzhny, in his interview with The Economist, said he would like to do it, but that he doesn't have the men or the resources to do it at the moment. He needs at least another 300 tanks, 700 infantry fighting vehicles, 500 howitzers to be able to carry out an offensive of that kind, or indeed an offensive anywhere. So let's put all these claims about Ukrainian offensives aside. Let's suggest that Ukraine simply goes onto the defensive, perhaps launching these occasional drone and missile strikes deep into Russian territory. How can it continue and win this war, exhaust the Russians with these forces that are shrinking all the time, when Russian forces appear to be growing by the day in power and scale? I mean, every day now I see more films of large convoys of Russian tanks heading towards the battle zones, and infantry fighting vehicles, and, you name it. There's even a claim, which, by the way, I don't take particularly seriously, that the Russians have deployed 3 of the ultra-new, high-tech Armator tanks to the battle zone, perhaps possibly, if they are really there, to test them out and see how effective they actually are, but obviously not in any way to cause a real difference to the fighting. But anyway, we have all of this going on the Russian side, and we have a Ukrainian army that has suffered high casualties, many of whose units are not adequately trained, some of whom suffer from extreme fatigue, and who need more weapons and more ammunition, which the West is finding it extremely difficult, increasingly difficult to supply. The last Pentagon arms delivery, in my opinion, was unimpressive. It was the Patriot missile battery that we heard so much about accounts for far and away the greater part of the $2 billion that the cost of that Patriot battery accounts for the $2 billion, most of the $2 billion that this package represents. The rest of the weapon systems that were supplied were the sort we've seen before and in an ever diminishing scale. Putin has said that the Russians, he's 100% sure that Russia can knock out this Patriot missile battery. I've no doubt that it's true. It seems it won't be particularly mobile. And, well, to be honest, it's not going to change anything on the battlefields. And I've talked about, and Brian Beletic has talked about, and others, The Guardian even has talked about the fact that there is a Patriot missile shortage and that there is, in fact, little ability to keep up with the kind of demands Ukraine might make in terms of its Patriot missiles if it uses them in a kind of profligate way. And that Guardian article even told us that Ukraine is now running out of HIMARS missiles because they've been using them at such a rate, disregarding advice from the US to use them only against priority targets. So what is Ukraine's pathway to victory? It can't realistically hope, or so it seems to me, to carry out an offensive. Lieutenant Colonel Vashinin, in that article that I discussed just before the holiday, said that Ukraine is coming under constant pressure to carry out offensives, which, by the way, is true. But even the Financial Times accepts that the prospects of offensives are now getting fewer as Russian defenses become harder. So, little prospect of offensives, even if they go on to the defensive. They're facing an enemy, Russia, that is vastly more powerful than themselves and which will go on grinding them down. And of course, if they go on fighting as they are fighting, to hold on to every millimeter of territory, as they're currently doing in Bakhmut, for example, well, that will make the process of Ukraine being ground down, even more complete when it is finally concluded, which will probably be even faster than if the Ukrainians took a more flexible approach to defense. One way or the other, I cannot see a path for Ukraine to win this war. Now, I cannot believe that there are commentators in the West who don't understand that. I say commentators, I mean analysts in the West who don't understand that and who are not advising governments. So why do we continue with this war? What are we thinking we are doing by continuing to support this war? Are we hoping that some great event will happen somewhere, either on the battlefields, that the Russians will make some big mistake? Surovikin so far has shown no sign of doing that. Maybe all this talk about, an advance on Volyn or an attack on Kiev is intended to draw the Russians into a trap in order to engineer that kind of big Russian mistake. Well, it happens, but again, I don't think Surovikin is the kind of person who's going to fall for that sort of thing. That's not the impression of him that I've got. So, if that's not going to work, what else is there? Well, there's been some excitement, as I discussed in previous programs, about the fact that the ruble slipped a little. It's gone up again a little over the course of December. It's sort of stabilized for the moment. I don't know whether it's going to continue to do that. I've talked about that already. I'm not going to waste more time on it. There's no sign of an economic collapse in Russia. In fact, to the extent that we have any evidence, it suggests that the Russian economy is actually starting to gear up and accelerate. And this flood of defense orders that the Collegium meeting highlighted a few days ago, well, that probably is going to stimulate the industrial side of the economy even more. So no sign of an economic collapse. Political crisis in Moscow? Was that what that whole Wall Street Journal article was all about? Telling us that, this is an isolated, paranoid, crazy leader, Putin at the center of things, a bit like a certain Austrian gentleman supposedly was towards the end of the last war, sending out increasingly surreal orders from his bunker. A view, by the way, that has now come under some question within academic historical studies, but that's a big topic which I'm not going to start on here. But anyway, maybe that's still the hope, that there's going to be some sort of events in Moscow displacing Putin, removing Putin from the scene, somebody else takes over. Who is that someone else? Who is that person who is going to take over from Putin? It certainly doesn't look like anybody in the Kremlin is interested in doing it. Medvedev, the vice chair of the Security Council, well, he's not only shown himself repeatedly to be intensely loyal to Putin, but he's taking an even more hardline position on the war than Putin himself. So who else? The Prime Minister, Mishustin, the Defense Minister, Shoigu, are they the people going to launch the putsch? The oligarchs? How do they do that? How do the oligarchs organize a move against Putin? So who is going to organize this putsch, this operation from within the Kremlin against Putin? And as for a popular movement to displace Putin, which is, by the way, in part what the distorted explanations of this Medusa poll is all about. I say Medusa poll, it's not actually by Medusa, but published by Medusa. And what I'm saying about this, by the way, is not, I say distorted, I'm not saying Medusa has distorted it, just to clarify that. But this distorted and overexcited, misreporting of this poll, this Kremlin poll, to give an impression that support for the war has collapsed in Russia, well, that's not actually what is really happening. And given that, as I said, the economy is stable, the prospects of some kind of colour revolution, especially as all the people who might be expected to lead such a colour revolution in Russia are now either in prison, as in the case of Navalny, for example, or abroad, well, that doesn't seem very likely either. So I come back to this question. What is Ukraine's pathway to peace? I've asked this question before. I ask it again. The counteroffensives in the autumn achieved nothing of strategic value. They've resulted in Ukraine suffering very heavy losses, irreplaceable losses. So what is the solution? Is the idea that we just keep this war going indefinitely, even as Ukraine whittles away? I mean, that, as I said, the only consequence of that is it's going to make the Russian victory, when it comes, more total. So I am very much at a loss to understand Western policy now. But there is a well-known concept in international relations studies that when a political class overinvests in a particular policy, when they've poured money and resources and suffered heavy losses through that policy, the temptation is not to pull back, but to double down, because of course pulling back would be an admission that that earlier investment had been a wasted investment. According to this theory in international relations studies, this process can go on for a very, very long time until eventually reality breaks through and there's a recognition finally that the investment has been lost, and at that point a negotiation happens, and it happens very fast sometimes, and that negotiation can result in the political class surrendering positions that they'd previously said they would never do. Well, perhaps we are in that kind of a process. But all I would say is it's a process which is being paid for, obviously, through growing economic disruption in the West itself, but largely at the expense of the Ukrainian people and of the Ukrainian nation and of the Ukrainian state. If the eventual outcome, as Putin has always said, is negotiations, the better thing to do is to negotiate now rather than wait until that point comes. Already we see 27% of Russians, they don't want to negotiate at all, it seems. And as I said, that figure has gone up and it's gone down. It was much higher in the summer of the aftermath of the Severodonetsk, Lysychansk wins, but it's fallen back since then. But Bakhmut falls, if Donbass is cleared, if the Russians reach the Dnieper, well, it might be increasingly difficult, again, to persuade Russian public opinion to agree to negotiations. I think, personally, it'd be very difficult to get them to agree even now. So, having said that, some real attempt to negotiate? Apparently not. Apparently no plans for this. Some doubts apparently spreading. Olaf Scholz writing his interesting articles and speeches. Sunak doing his audits. Odd, interesting articles now appearing in the media in the West. But we're far from that point yet. Well, there we go. That's me for the day. I just wanted to say, as a parenthesis, the final part of this article, that I've been getting reports over the course of this video that the situation in Serbia and Kosovo is deteriorating again. Apparently the Serb president says that he's received something equivalent to an ultimatum from the Western powers. I'm not sure what the terms of that ultimatum are, but apparently it's connected in some way with a demand that the Serb residents in Kosovo take down certain barricades they've constructed to prevent the Kosovo police and authorities from taking steps in their areas. It seems that the Serb president is in the process of discussions with his senior military and political advisors, and we'll see what happens. I'm only getting sketchy information about this, just as I still haven't, by the way, had a full account of the report from Engels, the Ukrainian attack on that particular airbase. And probably and presumably we will be seeing a further big Russian missile strike. There's said to be pictures again of it being in preparation, and who knows, maybe there will also be other things. As I said, it's clear that the fighting in Kremenaya in northern Lugansk and southern Kharkiv region has been very intense over the last few hours. So more from me about all of those topics, but as I said, that's me for the day. Thank you for joining me again. Remember, you can find all my videos, all our videos, Alex Mercouris, Alex Christoforou, the Duran videos on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin, Telegram, and you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and buy the great things that you will find there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those great things. And last but not least, please remember, if you like this video, to check your subscription and to tick the like button to this video. Thank you again. More from me soon, and have a very good day.